we, after your last presentation, we had another meeting among ourselves to discuss various aspects of your presentation and various thoughts that people got provoked into and various insights people got into. And there was a very, very enriching and fruitful discussion that went on among ourselves. And connecting your lecture to some of the old theses, literary theses that were prevalent in Telugu progressive literary circles, and some of the old documents were also came into the discussion, and very, very vibrant discussion took place. In fact, it helped us a lot in looking at many things afresh. In fact, even we have taken a decision to look some of the old documents written by some famous literary critics who were trying to grapple with this problem, were trying in their own way, a fresh attempt to understand literature or develop a kind of a theoretical understanding of literature from a Marxist perspective. And we had our own impressions because we read all those documents in several decades ago, maybe 2 decades ago, and we were also under different kinds of influences, so we formed our opinions on those documents. We realized that maybe we should go ahead and revisit them once again and look at them and what actually they were trying to do. Some of the, mostly some of the texts which were rejected by establishment of progressive literature, literary organizations, especially those documents which were rejected. We need to give some patient and relooking at those documents and all that. So it gave lots and lots of fresh thinking and fresh discussion among others, and it helped us a lot to see things from a different perspective. So that is the background to our discussion today. So you please go ahead with your presentation.
Yeah, well, we are, Sudhir mainly, and now Subhash also has translated. Sudhir has done a wonderful job of transcribing it. So it looks much better than actually what I was doing. So what we are discussing, the reason I am pointing that out is that what we are discussing, we should take that as the background material or background argument. If we were to write a formal document about what literature is, how literature should be seen from a Marxist viewpoint, and what should be done with it, then it will take more work, and some of the arguments that we make in these discussions, they will be further elaborated, but some of the arguments may not find place in that kind of formal document. So we should keep that in mind, that in this discussion, it is not so much formal presentation or well-developed argument. We are trying to enrich our own understanding, or we are rather not even enrich, we are rather preparing ourselves to have all necessary theoretical and intellectual and literary equipment to look at literature, from a Marxist viewpoint. So let us then let me make a few more comments, starting from what we did last time. You would remember that we talked about the theoretical background of superstructure, and we divided superstructure in 2 parts. One was the formal part, which is a state and constitution and laws and the ideas behind those formal parts. That part of superstructure is easier to understand from a Marxist viewpoint. It fits more easily into the Marxist understanding of some kind of base superstructure model. Because okay, if suppose there is a revolution and the system changes from capitalism to socialism, then that part of superstructure will change very easily. That change you can notice because there will be a different constitution, there will be different set of laws and different kind of institutions and so on. So that is the easy part. We realize, or we were arguing last time, that the more difficult part is the rest of superstructure. And the rest of superstructure, for just as a code word, we will call it culture. Now, culture is a very general term. Whatever people think, in whatever way they behave, their way of life, their ideas, right or wrong, all their ideas, ideologies, and way of life, all that, all that forms a part of culture. And for example, religion we took as a major example, and that is more difficult to understand because you see this part of culture like religion, or in our case caste system, or globally the gender issue, that persists over hundreds or even thousands of years, so it's not that easy to understand. That's one point we made. Now in culture, we should further differentiate that we are talking about whatever people do and think and believe and act, all that forms part of culture, but all that is not literature. So literature is a very specialized part of culture. It's everything in literature or everything in culture that is in written form is not literature. So literature, we use, just to remind you, we will have to be careful in using the term literature, because literature in English is used in two different ways. For example, my field was physics, and when we would talk about some physics issue, we will say that, oh, we know we know in the literature it is well established. Okay, Einstein's general theory of relativity is well established in literature. So we are not talking about Valmiki or Tulsidas or Shakespeare. We are talking about literature in the sense of literature attached with that special professional field of obvious. I am just saying it for completeness sake that we are not using the term literature in that sense. So we are using the term literature in the literary sense. So that was one background, and the other background we discussed last time was about whatever roughly in a metaphoric way, in a way useful for us, whatever we can say about human mind. So we are not going to turn into neurobiologist or cognitive scientist or anything. We are not going to get into that kind of detail, but we have to have some idea about human mind. And we said that in a metaphoric way, in an example way, we will say that human mind has three layers. One is the species mind, which gives us the capacity of language, capacity of communication through words, written or vocal, or spoken. That is the best example of a species mind. All humans have that. All humans have language. Language is diverse, and different. That becomes then the other part of mind. Social mind intervenes there. But at a basic level, language is part of the species mind. The second layer is social mind. Social mind is that we are raised by a society, and the society that rages us, in a way constructs us, deposits things in our head, in our mind. And that layer of mind, which is socially constructed, that is another layer. And then we also talked about the third layer, which we called rational layer, but it's very difficult to really be accurate about it. I mean, it's that part of individual's mind which, even though socially, culturally constructed, can go beyond the social and cultural construction and look at reality in a cross-cultural way. So it is, in this layer, the third layer, will almost look like a species mind, that layer, but it is different from that, because this layer has emerged more strongly in the modern period, when modernity, modern science, rationality, all these things have become established, and when humanity has learned to differentiate between whatever we believe and whatever is true. Now, that is a very difficult division, because whatever is true, how does anyone know whatever is true? So true is something that philosophers often talk about. Truth is what? Truth is justified belief. This, the one way they put it is that truth is nothing but justified belief. So okay, I mean, that is one step forward. It is a belief, but you have to justify it. You cannot just say that I believe, hence it is true. You will have to prove that it is true. And in science, you take help from experiments and what nature tells about it. And in other realms of knowledge, you take help of other kinds of facts. So we talked about that. So these three layers of mind, that was the background. And in that, beyond that, we made some comments about literature. Now, I will not repeat all that, and maybe it will get repeated in a new way, or in an approximate way, in whatever I am going to say today. But let us begin with the kind of argument that I want to make today. A glimpse of all this thing you have seen the previous day already. So there isn't going to be much new material, but maybe we will be able to bring in some more clarity, and some more dimensions about how should we look at literature. So when we talk of literature in this slide, there are two things, and this also we talked about last time. One is that what is literature, and the other is what does it do. Well, you can have three questions now coming to think of it, that what is literature, how do you create it, and what does it do? So one is the ontological question, existence question, what is literature? The other is the production question, who produces it and how? And once it is produced, once it begins to exist and progress, develop, evolve, then what does it do, in rest of reality? So what does it do in society, or what does it do to the individual, or what does it do to the mind? These are the dimensions of all the questions that we should keep in mind when we are grappling with the thing that how do we want to understand literature from a Marxist viewpoint. Now, one division that is not canonical, I mean, I will not say that everybody should make that division, but I think that it is helpful, and one thing I will repeat, I will urge you, I will appeal to you, that do not take any of the statements that are being made, as some kind of thesis. We are trying to present a background under which we can, in future, create some theses about literature. So when I am saying that, I would like to, there are many different ways that you can divide, or many different locations from which you can view literature. One division I would like to make is what I call the horizontal and the vertical. By horizontal, largely I mean social. You know, so we are part of society. There are social phenomena, which we are confronted with and which makes us, which constitutes us, in various ways. So, for example, when we were talking about religion, or we were talking about uh, we were talking about caste, or we were talking about gender, these are all aspects that live out there in the society. They live in our mind too. Nothing exists for us. Nothing social exists for us unless and until it also exists in our mind. Suppose I go into coma, then does these social facts or any fact exist for me? The world is out there, but for me it doesn't exist, because I am no longer conscious of it. So whenever we are talking about any of the social facts, especially in things like literature, we are also at the same time looking at the personal. Looking at, not personal is the wrong word, I should say, looking at the individual mind. So the way we talked last time, there is no social mind. Society lives in the individual mind. And because society deposits things in the individual mind becomes socially constructed. And then many individual minds begin to resonate with each other, agree with each other, becoming part of the same culture. And when they become part of the same culture, similar things are deposited in each one of those individual minds, and they begin to resonate with each other, agree with each other, start understanding things in unison. Then we say that there is a social mind. So social mind is a metaphor. So why I am saying this, that in this division that I make about between the social and the psychological, social is the horizontal dimension. I call it horizontal because it expands, beyond and around the individual. And the vertical dimension is the psychological dimension. What happens inside the individual mind? So will you say, for example, that since our mind is largely constructed by society and most of the content of our mind is deposited in our mind by society, so that is all there is to mind. In the individual mind, only society is there. So, okay, raw material is natural, raw material is the brain, raw material is the body, but whatever the content is there, out of that raw material, mind somehow emerges. So mind somehow is constructed. And once mind is constructed, all the content, is it only social? Well, even if that is something to keep in mind, because that is something in our enthusiasm for the horizontal dimension. In our circles, in Marxist and activist circles, horizontal dimension dominates everything. Social dimension dominates everything. That is why I am making this point in this kind of get together, which is activist and Marxist circle of ours, community of ours, that even if all the content were to be deposited only by the society, which is not true, nature also deposits things. But I will not go into all the arguments. Let us assume, for simplicity's sake, that all contents of our mind are socially generated or socially deposited. Will there be any vertical dimension? Will there be any psychological, personal, individual, what is the good word? I don't know. I know many words.
Idiosyncratic.
Huh?
Idiosyncratic, some kind.
No, not idiosyncratic. I mean I did not want to use the word spiritual dimension, but something like that, the individual psychological dimension, that do I as a given individual, do I as Ravi whatever is deposited in my mind by society, do I add something to that? Or do I distort that? Or do I suppress some of it and underline some others? So am I acting as an agent beyond my own social construction? You see the point. I am taking a simple point that I am socially constructed. So whatever exists in my mind is deposited by society. So I am a socially constructed person, being. And then I am asking the question that if I am socially constructed person, then are there many Ravis? All of them are socially constructed. Are we clones of each other because we are created by the same society? And if society deposits the same thing in all our minds, practically we should be clones of each other. Practically we should be more or less copies of each other. And yet we are so different from each other. Most of the content in our mind is deposited by society, and yet our individuality, our individual mind, our personal psychology does not go away. In fact, everything gets amalgamated differently in each individual's mind. So even though society is same, and later on we will come to society is not same. There are different locations in the society, and society does not deposit same thing in every individual's mind. That is how race will come in, caste will come in, gender will come in, class will come in, various locations of the society. We will come to that complication later. But right now I am using a code word society as if it is one monolith society. And I am using a code word, an experimental individual. Everything in the individual's mind is being deposited by the society. And if that is where the story ended, then we will all be copies of each other. Okay, because by definition, our mind was socially constructed by the same society, and every content was. But that does not happen. That does not happen, and there are many reasons for that. There are social reasons for that. But there are biological reasons for that too, and there are individual psychological reasons for that too, because, for the simple reason that our own personal history does not run parallel to each other. We don't have the same history. Even twins who are born to the same mother, at the same time, at the moment, few minutes apart, and they are raised in the same family, they develop different personalities. The twins developed it. So there may be biological reasons, but we are not getting into that. We are into the socialization thing, and we are into so individual histories do not exactly overlap. So every individual has individual history despite commonality of social history, despite commonality of family history and so on. So that individual history brings in difference, but also for various reasons we don't know very well. I am not an expert, and I have a feeling that science does not know it very well yet. That how individual personalities develop so different from each other. Where do individuals come from? So often, because the 19th and mostly 20th century was a time when socialization was underlined, when it was pointed out that society creates individuals, and that was a very important thing. Otherwise, you would not understand. You will neither understand society nor understand individuals. So do not think that I am undermining the social construction of individuals. I am not undermining the social construction of individuals. But you should not go, and later on I will come to examples, you should not go to the other extreme and think that individuality has gone away, or individuality gives rise to something not so desirable, which is individualism. So individuality should not be equated with individualism, and individuality cannot be completely submerged and dissolved into social construction. That's the point I am making. So the first point, if we follow from last time and advance our argument a little further, then in the mind part, as it relates to literature, the mind aspect of literature, I will make this division, and I will ask you to keep in mind when we advance our argument further, that there is this division which emanates from our mind itself, that our mind is socially constructed, and yet individuality does not dissolve. Individuality does not go away. Because if individuality is dissolved and go away, and that individual particularity or individual singularity is not there, then we will all be copies of each other. At least, the people who are part of the same strongly culturally held community, where most of the material deposited in the mind comes from a well-defined culture, a well-defined community. All members of that strongly defined community will be more or less copies of each other. And there are aspects where we might appear copies of each other. We all Indians in some way, in some very loose, dilute way, may appear copies of each other, to an Australian, or to a Swiss guy, or to an African guy. We may appear, who knows, we look at ourselves and we think that, oh, I am so different from Subhash or Bhargav. So we emphasize, the difference. But, some guy from very far away culturally may see us as copies of each other, who knows. So you remember, things are not that simple. And yet the point I am right now underlining is the point that no matter how we will become, how strongly socially constructed, individuality will not go away. Okay, so what does it have to do with literature? A whole lot. You will see this will play a very big role in determining our approach to literature, and in also figuring out that how literature functions in a society. In a society which is only socially constructed, where we are more or less copies of each other, where we are more or less, I am making it a little bit more complex. We are not exactly copies of each other, but we are more or less copies of each other. So we are largely socially constructed, where individuality is dilute, or let us undermine that for argument's sake. In that society, the function of literature will be very different from a society, actual society. In actual society, no matter what you think about any society, that this society is backward and more traditional and more panchayat-like, more village-like, where everybody appears to have similar ideas because they are so strongly constructed by that culture. But do not be fooled, the individuals are very strong sitting in that khap panchayat. When they are pronouncing, sitting in the khap, I suddenly jumped to some example without giving you a warning. So I have brought in khap panchayat. By this khap panchayat, I mean the traditionally constructed society. Let us say that. And members who are sitting in that traditionally, strongly, deeply constructed society don't think that they are not individuals. When they are pronouncing judgments on others, in unison with complete, what is the word? Not majority, but
consensus or agreement.
When they have a consensus about pronouncing a judgment about one individual or somebody from outside, don't think that they have consensus about everything. They are very strong individuals sitting in that khap panchayat, appearing as part of one head, one culture, one village, one khap, and so on. And yet, individuality has not gone away. So when you come to this kind of actual society and you ask that will literature play a different function in this actual society compared to that hypothetical society where people are constructed in such a way that they are, for practical purposes, copies of each other, clones of each other. I don't even know that whether literature can be generated in a society where people are clones of each other, And even if, literature somehow generated in that kind of society or comes from outside that society, will that function in the same way in a society of clones, you know, uh, as compared to an actual society which is also socially constructed but individuals have not gone away? So you see the point I am making, that literature, when you are dealing with literature, you cannot, just because we are from movement, we come from Marxism, we underline the horizontal dimension, the social dimension, we cannot say that individuality is always a bad thing or individuality is something that results only in individualism. No. So keep that in mind. Now, what has happened? What has happened to to literature? Let us say as an institution. I mean, last time probably we mentioned that it is a wonder which does not appear to us as wonder. I mean, most wonderful things in nature as well as in society are those which do not appear wonderful at all, which appear very, very commonplace, very commonplace. For example, gravitation appears very commonplace, but you would know that still physicists don't understand gravitation. So whatever is most commonplace, taken for granted, at times that may be the most difficult thing to understand. And one such thing is that why do all cultures have literature? Okay, if somebody comes up with an example that some culture does not have literature, that tribe in Andaman Nicobar that does not interact with the rest of humanity, I don't know whether they have literature or not. Probably not. But maybe the definition of literature can be enlarged. Do they tell stories to each other? I'm sure they must be telling stories to each other, even if written literature is not there, or even if written language is not there. So in some generalized sense, I can say that all cultures have literature. And don't you think that that's a wonder? It is a wonder. It is a surprising thing, So if all cultures have literature, then there must be a theory of literature which explains why humans need literature. We have to go at that level. Literature is that fundamental. Literature is that much integral to human being, not just, one culture or another, not just some culture having very high literature and others have very backward literature. Those are finer divisions. But at some level, at a general level, all cultures, whole humanity has literature, and that I can tell you, I don't understand how. Where does it live? I can understand in a general way that evolution requires that we learn about natural laws, nature, in a practical way, without science, just by the hunters and gatherers, 40,000 years ago. They also observed nature, and learned whatever was necessary. Otherwise they wouldn't survive. They wouldn't escape from the predator. They would starve. They would be, killed in a hailstorm. If they did not find a shelter, in nick of time. So I can understand that okay, humanity needed those things to develop those knowledges. Humanity needed later on to do agriculture. So that also I can understand, because then we can eat better, and live better if we start doing agriculture. But we do agriculture, that we understand, but why do we do culture? So that becomes different. But even that I can understand, that we do culture because we communicate with each other, we have to set some rules of living together and so on, But then the question becomes more and more difficult when you go to the finer and finer divisions, that why do we do literature? So I can understand why we do agriculture, I can understand why do we do culture, because we can't help it. We will live in some way, we will form some habits, and that will become culture. We will form some tradition, and that will become culture. But why do we do literature? The answer is not that obvious, okay? I mean, it relates to culture, it relates to the fact that human mind is developing socially. Human mind is developing in interaction with each other. Individuals are developing. So they start telling stories to each other. They start telling truth sometimes, and they start telling lies most of the time. Somehow, we humans develop that trait. We do speak truth sometimes, but most of the time we speak, lies. And if you are, if you are a prime minister of a country like India, you speak lies most of the time. So it's the why is literature such a universal phenomenon? We have to keep in mind when we rush to conclusions that literature is an instrument, or literature is an expression, or literature is emotion, or literature is commodity. All those conclusions, we should think about it when we rush to conclusions. That if literature is a commodity, then commodities came much later. I mean, if you really look at it, in our hands, in our circles, literature is a instrument or a weapon. Mostly we say that, okay, literature, what for? What does your literature do? Have you taken side? Have you taken side of the working class? Is your literature serving the working people, working class? And is your is your literature advancing the cause of revolution and so on? So you remember when we start, and none of these things I am rejecting. All these are good questions. We should always ask these questions. I am not rejecting the question itself. But if you reduce literature to that, then you should realize that literature is only that, and everything else is crap. Everything else is wrong ideology. Everything else is fooling people. So everybody, Shakespeare and Tulsidas, they all were fooling people. It is only we, the representatives of the working class, some of us also create literature. It is only we who are not fooling people. Everybody else was fooling people. Everybody else was doing the serving some other class, which was not our class. If it will be reduced. Literature will become reduced to that, and that I think will be a wrong thing to do. So that is why. So either literature is seen as I was saying last time, as an army or as a battalion or whatever brigade, of the revolutionary army, or it is seen as some high-end commodity that some guys will write something which is so difficult to understand that only few people will understand, and those few people who will understand it, they will be privileged because they understand it, So all those, clearer example is painting. Those paintings which you can't understand, but they will sell for millions of dollars, those paintings, of some famous painter, So that becomes a high-end market. So either you see literature as commodity or high-end commodity or some kind of industry, or you see literature as some kind of weapon, some kind of army, that does not do justice. This kind of instrumentalist or utilitarian understanding of literature does damage to the concept of literature, and does damage to our cause, because if literature was only for consumption, and if literature was only for advancing some cause, was roped into some struggle of those times, then why would literature survive long after those causes are gone? Just the question that we asked about religion. Maybe religion was a product of some kind of class society. But then, why would religion survive long after those class societies which produced it are long gone? Additional question is that, thousands of years ago, when those kinds of class societies which were producing religion, they were so diverse and did not know about each other. The people who were, in Abrahamic land, in the Middle East, and people who were in China, and people who were the Native Americans, what are known as, Aborigines, that is a racist term, but you understand, I am not a racist, they did not know about each other. The cultures and civilizations which thousands of years ago did not know about each other, unknowing that others are doing the same thing, they all created religion for themselves. How did that happen? So it's a similar question, that people who did not know about each other created religion of different kinds, but nevertheless the less religion. Same way, people, culture, civilizations which did not know about each other, in some their own specific ways, they created literature. So something more universal is going on. Something more general, is going on. Now, if this kind of universality is there, this kind of depth is there, this kind of not only horizontality but also verticality is there. Individual species mind somehow comes into play when it comes to literature. Then can you define literature in some utilitarian way, what it does? Can the function of literature, will that be enough to define literature? Our answer should be that it should not. And I have made a simple point, but remember, these simple points don't get made. That if you have only functional viewpoint of literature, literature is what it does, that kind of thing. Literature is what sides it takes. Literature is what it is used for. Then you are not doing justice to literature. And this is not some very highly theoretical point I am making. This has political implications. So I'll make just one more theoretical point, and then I will come to some operational things. Let us talk about the horizontal dimension, sociality, or the social dimension, because social dimension in 20th century has dominated all social theory, all cultural theory. The social dimension has dominated. And we are Marxists, the story started with Marx, if not earlier. Marx emphasized the social dimension too. So the social dimension, I will take it. Remember, who am I to negate the social dimension? No Marxist will ever negate the social dimension. Social dimension will always be the prime example of anything related to human culture. We know all that. And yet you see what kinds of problems arise. There are various ways of doing things, and in our discussion in future, hopefully, all those things will become underlined. But I just took one theoretical point as an example. And that is, I took the example of standpoint theories. Standpoint theories are a specific set of theories which have been very popular, which have an old origin, in Hegel and Marx and so on, but which have become very popular in later half of 20th century. And what does it say? The standpoint theory says that your socially located position gives you the vantage point of looking at the world. So, and those vantage points are socially constructed. So the way a woman will look at the world will be very different from the way a man would look at the world. Or the way a Savarna will look at the world will be very different from the way Dalit will look at the world. And not only look at the world, but experiencing the world. A woman will experience the world very differently from the way a man would experience the world. Now, perfectly agreeable. It's obvious that we are socially constructed. We already said that most of the content is deposited in our mind by society. You know, but then society is not just one thing. There are axes in the societies. There are locations in the society. Different individuals are located at different locations, and sometimes you can draw a line through those different locations so that many people will fall on the same line. So people are standing in a hall, they all have different locations, but you can draw a line in that hall, and that line you can call gender. And many people will fall on that line, which is called gender. Of course, it's an artificial example. So not all women will stand in one line when they are randomly assembled in a hall. So it will be very different to have a straight line. So maybe it will be a crooked line. Maybe it will be maybe it will be a line that will go and here and there. But you can draw a line through all the women in the hall, and that line that you can draw through all the women in the hall will be called gender. So we know that there are locations. Okay. And the standpoint theory says that the location of a subset, location of a group, defines the worldview of that group. So the location of women, collective location of women, defines the worldview of women. Collective location of Dalits defines the worldview of Dalits, and so on. Now you ask the question that, okay, so that is a tautology. Everybody will have a location, so everybody will have a worldview, and everybody will have one kind, will fall on one kind of line, but every individual will fall on different lines. So an individual may find himself or herself, on at one place on the gender line, but wherever that individual is standing, maybe Dalit line will cross from there. So that individual will be a woman, and that individual will be a Dalit. But then inside Dalit, maybe it will be a Madiga, or maybe it will be a Mala, maybe it will be a Mahar, or maybe it will be a Valmiki. Where does that end? When you go through all the subdivisions, then you end up again at the individual, and no individual is exactly same as another individual. So what good is a standpoint theory? A standpoint theory says, it is very good theory, it is useful theory. It says that, okay, you are going to have a theory of the society and theory of how people come to know about society. And a standpoint theories are mostly epistemological theories, mostly about theories of knowledge, how knowledge is socially constructed and how knowledge is socially located, how the knower is socially located, and social location of the knower determines the kind of knowledge of that knower. It is good for that. The other thing that it adds is, which became very popular in later part of 20th century, is that in order to fight the privilege of universal knowledge, it proved that there is no universal knowledge, and people who claim to have universal knowledge, they are the traditional elite. They are the elite, and they have knowledge from their location, but they declare that their knowledge is not from a specific location. Their knowledge is the universal knowledge, so it is knowledge for everybody. So they eliminated location. They eliminated social construction of the knower, and that was the criticism of the socially constructed theories of knowledge. That was the criticism presented by one example I am taking today, the standpoint theories. They said that no, even they had a standpoint. Even those people who claimed that knowledge is universal, their knowledge was not universal because it was colored by where they were looking from. It was colored by their location. Okay, fine. But then, if everybody has a equal claim to knowledge from whatever location that person is standing, are we not falling into complete relativism of knowledge? Complete relativism means every individual's knowledge is equal to every other individual's knowledge, because knowledge is completely socially constructed, and social construction depends on the location of that individual. So if individual is defined by that location, and that location is strongly implicated in the kind of knowledge that individual can have, then how do you compare the knowledge of one individual with another? So a complete chaos sets in, a complete relativism comes in, and that cannot be the case. That is not true. It's not true that all knowledges are equal or all knowledges are relative. So for social movement purpose, what became very popular in later half of 20th century was said that we will relatively privilege the knowledge of the underprivileged. So the people who have been privileged so far, their knowledge is their power, and they have used their knowledge, in the power structure. So in order to contest that, in order to confront that or challenge that, we will begin to privilege the knowledge of the underprivileged. So a kind of choice was made that, okay, knowledge is socially constructed, knowledge can be variously constructed. We should not fall into complete relativism that all knowledge have equal validity. So, and they have said, the oppressors or rulers or traditionally powerful people have said that their knowledge is universal. So we the oppressed, we the underprivileged will not say that our knowledge is universal, but we will say that our knowledge is privileged. And we will say that you have not experienced what I have experienced. You have always, done away with my knowledge. You have declared as non-knowledge, or ignorance, So I will privilege the knowledge of the underprivileged. So a kind of preference. You see what is happening. In the kind of social value is coming into theory, and the kind of social value is coming into any, and it will come into literature too. Since we are discussing literature today, the way it will come is that we will begin to, from this standpoint theory, we will begin to privilege the literature of the underprivileged. A kind of theorization will emerge, that the literature of the elite, literature of the ruler, literature of the oppressed, literature of the Savarna, literature of the man, literature of the white man, that has been the canonical form of literature, that has been the Shastriya root, that has been the standard form, and we are going to challenge that by saying that you have negated our literature. You cannot have the experience I can have. And most of the time, large number of people, their experience was negated by literature because they were not recognized as creators of literature. So now we will privilege the literature of the underprivileged, and we will say that the literature of the underprivileged not only is a privileged literature, not only brings to light those dimensions of social life which were long ignored for thousands of years. So now that should be the privileged form of literature. Okay, this is how this in a rough way. In a few minutes, what can I do? All these things are very controversial, and there are very elaborate theories, and there have been very, very contentious movements, in literature about all these things. So I am kind of caricaturing it, but I am trying to present a context to all the literary movements that have been there. So this is how, let us say, Dalit literature or Afro-American literature or feminist literature, all these things come into picture, and they start challenging the older literature of the privileged people, And the way I am saying, I am not criticizing one way or the other. I am just describing to you the way things have happened. Now, in the light of what we have said, what do we say to that? What do we say to this kind of privileging of the underprivileged? Privileging of the underprivileged is by and large acceptable to us because of the historical wrong that was done to a underprivileged community. If an underprivileged community or a group or a gender was prevented from knowledge, was prevented from expressing their experience or turning their experience into literary forms, then it is a very good thing that has happened, in modern times, that they have started generating literature from their standpoint. I welcome that. We all Marxists welcome that. There is no doubt about that. But you have to ask the question that once you recognize this phenomenon, are you going to say that from now on, literature is going to be only this social dimension? When you write, when you create literature, then how do you judge one Dalit writer's writing compared to another Dalit writer's writing? So then you say that is the criteria going to be that whichever depicts the Dalit experience in the most useful way or most creative way, so whoever represents the Dalit horizontality, Dalit sociality, Dalit social existence the best way, that is the best Dalit writer? Okay, largely I will agree, but I will say that still it doesn't answer the full question. Will that Dalit writer who is very successful and who is the most powerful Dalit writer depicting the social experience of Dalit, does he bring in any of the vertical dimension into it? Does the vertical dimension, namely his own individual psychological dimension, does that come into play? He cannot avoid it. He or she cannot avoid it. It will come into play, because that is why it is very common that in Dalit literature, since it is experience-based, experience is a double-edged sword. Experience represents the Dalit experience, but it also, because it is experience, it has to be necessarily experience of an individual. So it is Dalit experience, but it is not the experience of all Dalits. It is Dalit experience represented by one Dalit, who is the writer, who is writing his autobiography or his biography. So you see the vertical in this example too, the vertical dimension cannot be avoided. And if the vertical dimension cannot be avoided, then this combination of psychological dimension and social dimension, that is what creates literature. One general thing you can talk about literature is that if you have only social dimension, then it will be some kind of report, some kind of article about Dalit condition, some kind of theory about Dalit condition. It will not be literature. Literature requires having this vertical dimension. Literature requires this individual creativity. Literature requires the experience and emotion part, and if it requires the experience as well as the emotion part, the individual dimension, the vertical dimension cannot be avoided. So you see that even in the what we classify as Dalit literature, individual is very much present there. So what is the fight? What is the criticism from the Dalit side? Dalit side is that, okay, you don't speak, you are a Savarna, you don't speak about my experience. Okay? And if you speak, then somehow your Savarna location will speak in whatever you speak in literature. I am willing to accept even that. But just because in theory and in social movement, we privilege the underprivileged, we privilege the oppressed, does that mean that only authentic experience that you can have is that of the Dalit or that of the woman or that of the Native American? What about the experience of others? Because literature is not just that I can understand the logic of privileging the underprivileged. I can understand the justice that must be done to in the literary field, that people who were prevented from creating literature literature all these thousands of years now, it is a welcome thing that they are creating literature now, and I cannot judge their literature on my standards, or their literature cannot be judged only on the universal, quote unquote, so-called universal standards. But you cannot go to the other extreme and say that only authentic experience in the world today is the experience of those who come from the oppressed families, oppressed groups, oppressed communities, underprivileged, sets of humanity. Because that will not, you will see that if you write, for example, Dalit literature, are you writing only about Dalits, or will there be a character, Savarna character in your novel, in your Dalit novel? There will definitely be a Savarna character in your Dalit novel. Otherwise, the Dalit novel cannot be written. What will be a Dalit novel in which there are no Savarnas? Then the Dalit, you cannot shed any light on the Dalit location. What will be a feminist novel in which there are no men? Then you cannot shed any light on the condition of women. There cannot be a feminist novel without, and I also grant that when you are writing a feminist novel, you will look at man from a woman's viewpoint. That also I grant. But you see what you are doing. You are not describing only your own experience and only your own emotion. You are depicting somebody who you are not. If you are a woman writer, you are depicting a man's character, a man's feeling, a man's idea, a man's behavior, a man's location in your novel, in your feminist novel. So you see, you cannot avoid, and if you started writing novel from a feminist viewpoint, right, and you had this position that I will teach a lesson to all these men, all characters, all men characters in my novel will be devils, will be demons and devils. I mean, I will teach them a lesson because I cannot appear a single man appear in good light in my feminist novel. Then will that be a feminist novel? So it will not be a novel at all. It will not be a literature at all. When you have taken upon yourself in your feminist literature or in your Dalit literature, you have taken upon this task that you will right a historical wrong, and you will take revenge, or you will take, you will set the records right. And in order to set the records right, you have to uncover all the hidden demonic, devilish aspects of men. Okay, you can do that, you will do that, it is a welcome thing to do that, but if you do only that, then you are not really looking at reality as it is. You are not looking at history as it is. It is true that women have been oppressed, throughout the human history, but that does not mean that women will do away with men. That does not mean that in women's literature, men will appear only as Rakshasas. So, and if you are not doing that, then you are in some way trying to stand where a man is, even though you are a woman. You are in your novel, in your literature, you are trying to understand in the shoes of a man and trying to see the world from that vantage point. So that is another thing that comes out of this standpoint theory, of epistemology, or you can say of literature, that literature is created, number one, when when vertical dimension is added to the social dimension. Individual creativity and individual experience cannot be ruled out in any social creation of literature. So individual dimension comes in, whether it is, it was always the case. It was the case when literature was literature only of elites, only of oppressors. Now that literature is also of the underprivileged, also of the oppressed, even there the individual dimension will be there. But even that is not enough. The individual dimension of the writer is not enough. The writer will have to imagine the locations of others. The writer will have to stand in the shoes of somebody else's shoe and look at the world from that vantage point. Only then you will be able to succeed as a writer. Succeed. I am taking, by writer I mean not a small poem or not one poem. I am taking more classical forms or more larger forms where complexity of life is presented in one art form, like knowledge, like novel, and so on, or an epic, or a longer poem, whatever, or a narrative kind of thing. There, the location of others will come in. Of course, all this will be colored by your location as a feminist writer, your location as a Dalit writer. But you will have to ask access to others' epistemology, others' emotions. Same way, others will have to ask access to the Dalit mind, the woman's mind. So a man's novel will have woman's character, and if the man novelist, male novelist does not ask for access to a woman's mind, how will he write a good novel? So you see, things are very complex. I know that a male novelist, he cannot avoid somehow the male viewpoint sneaking into his overall worldview, sneaking into his overall novel. But that does not mean that literature is such a simple thing where a man would not try to at all to get into a woman's mind and yet will be able to produce a good novel. If a man has to produce a good novel, and even a novel that is colored by male viewpoint, male ideology, male psychology, yet that novelist, despite being a man, will have to ask for access to a, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, ask for access to a woman's mind. And same way, a feminist writer will ask for access to a man's mind. And that is how complexity is grappled with. That is why how you make sense of complexity of life. So you see this whole position. Now I will end by just one example. I know that these are very large subjects and I have taken enough time. But related to this, I will give you another example. What happens in our left? I am talking of. I have been giving example of social movements, of Dalit movement and Dalit, feminist movement and so on. What happens in our case? In the case of a leftist, of course, the usual things are there that so far most leftist writers have been Savarna writers or white writers or whatever you can say. The usual criticism we accept, that left has been dominated by the privileged, people and so on. But then what? That is not. I don't find that as a deep criticism. We can once society changes. We could not have done anyway if we only waited for women and Dalits and blacks to fill equal number of seats in the party central committee, 100 years ago, then the party would have never been formed. Okay? So don't put the blame of all human history on us. Where would we have found women and Dalits and blacks who did not get a chance to learn anything, do anything, who were always enslaved? Where would you get enough number of people to become prime ministers and presidents, to become central committee members of the... So humanity did what it did to women. Humanity did what it did to Dalits. And now you suddenly want equal number of Dalits and women on the central committee of the Communist Party, then you are putting all the blame of humanity on us poor communists, us poor Marxists, So please don't do that, you don't realize what you are asking for, okay? And we, on our part, we accept that yes, we may be constructed by the same society which constructed everybody else. So we may be male chauvinist, we may be racist, we may be Savarna, we recognize that, and we on our own did not recognize that enough. Partly we recognized on our own, we raised these questions before anybody else. But now that you are there, you a woman, you a Dalit, you a black, you a Aborigine, Native American, you are there, you are making us more aware, and we thank you for that. We Savarna communists, we white communists, we male communists, we thank you for that you have exposed our makeup, we have become aware of our makeup. That is true. But then we are asking that what happens to, are we then going to say that for 100 years only men have been in the Central Committee, for next 100 years only women will be on the Central Committee? I am deliberately caricaturing it. I am not saying that feminist movement is as foolish to ask for that. I am just making you a logical point. And the same thing comes about literature. So then what do we do about literature? If I am a Savarna, do I stop writing literature? Or you put the other way, that if you allow me, if you, a Dalit writer whose time has come, and Dalit writing is being privileged now, writing of all the underprivileged is being privileged now, if you allow me, being a Savarna, to write my own literature, are you going to say that, okay, I allow you to write literature, but remember, your literature will always be Savarna literature? So, you see, I don't know what to say to that. If by definition you say that because I am a Savarna, my literature will be Savarna literature, because you are by definition a Dalit, so your literature will be a Dalit literature, it doesn't work. Because if you say that if you are a Dalit and whatever you are writing is a Dalit literature, then by definition, if I am a Savarna, whatever I will write will become a Savarna literature. So then we have reduced literature to the social origin of the writer. And then all the argument I make that you cannot be a writer without standing in the shoes of somebody else. No. You cannot be a writer. You can only be an automaton. That you cannot help but behave only as a Savarna because you are a Savarna. You cannot help behave only as a Dalit because you are a Dalit. You cannot help behave only as a woman because you are a woman. That is not human being. That is an automaton. That is a computer. It is programmed to be a woman. It is programmed to be a Dalit. It is programmed to be a Savarna. But that is not how human beings are. So you see where these social movements and these social movement inspired literary movements, where they have taken the argument. I will leave it at that. I will leave it at that. I could say many things, but you think about it, that when in this age, in this era, it becomes, nobody can dare to criticize a Dalit writer, because now it has become, at least in certain circles, it has become the accepted thing that you cannot criticize, Dalit can criticize a Dalit, a Savarna, produced literature, but if it goes to the extent, if it becomes such a fashion that a woman's writing or a Dalit writing or a black man's writing cannot be criticized, then we have gone wrong. Then we are not doing justice to literature. We cannot reduce the argument to that level. Now, I was coming to the end to what happens in the case of. Let me just, I'm sorry to take more time, but one example I should also, one more example I should give, and then conclude with what happens in left. No. Suppose, take the example of Native Americans. No. Native Americans, they were destroyed. Their civilization was destroyed by Europeans, 500 years ago. Between 500 and 300 years ago. During a period of 200 years in America, both North and South, the entire civilization of Native Americans was destroyed. Now there are people of Native American origin there. No. It's not that no person exists. It's a very small minority, but they are there. What will be their literature? What will be their literature? Number one. Number two, what kind of so will their literature be only I understand very well that there cannot be a Native American literature which does not have memory of complete extermination of their civilization. Even if somebody wants to wipe it out, nobody can wipe it out. People who suffered much less than them, for example, Africans, for example, Jews, for example, Dalits, their memory cannot be wiped out. The Native Americans suffered much more than all these oppressed groups. So how can their memory be wiped out? So I'm sure that their literature will have a lot of memory of their civilizational extermination. But if it only has that, and if they stop their children to read Shakespeare, or Homer, or whatever, I mean our Valmiki, will that be a good thing? This question I raised last time, that what approach to take to the classical literature, even if that classical literature was created by the oppressor of that day, but now it has become classical. So, do you take a position on the literature compared to who were the people who created that literature and what they did to us? So, it was created by, Homer was an European, Shakespeare was an European, Europeans destroyed us, all over America, north and south, why do I read Shakespeare? Why do I read Homer? Can that attitude be taken? Or can that be Homer and Shakespeare be taken as examples only of exterminators? That everything else they are saying about, love and family and emotions of a daughter to a father or a son to a mother, all those are cooked up things. These guys are only butchers because they butchered us. So they don't do anything other than butchering. So how can they create literature? And their literature must somehow be an instrument of hiding their butcherous character as butchers. Can that simple attitude be taken? Nobody obviously takes that simple attitude. The Native American children go to the same universities and read the same literature and so on. And do you say that they are being brainwashed into believing that Europeans were not butchers? It is possible to consider that Europeans 500 years were acted as butchers. They butchered that civilization, and yet they developed also civilization. Yet there were human emotions among them. Yet is it a justification of European colonialism? So, in order to read the history of European colonialism, you are going to junk Shakespeare if you are a Native American? You see that the simple questions that I raise, these questions may appear obvious to us, but these obvious questions don't get raised. So keep that in mind. Now, what happens in left? One more malady, one more disease of this kind I will mention, which relates to us, and then I will stop, and then let us have discussion. That malady is that we evaluate literature on the basis of commitment of the writer. And we value on the basis of commitment of the writer, then we don't know where to stop. Then we don't just look at the writing of the writer, then we look at the life of the writer. And I'm not stopping us from doing that. Everybody looks at the life. How can anybody hide behind literature? Nobody can hide behind literature. So if somebody is a writer, what kind of human being he or she was, that cannot be hidden. That will always, people are free to look at that. But the question I am asking is that are you going to judge literature only on that count? And the example I will give is that, okay, Lorca, famous Spanish poet Lorca, from Spain. He was killed in the Spanish Civil War. In the beginning of the Spanish Civil War itself, in 1936 itself, when the Civil War was starting, he was killed by the right-wing forces. He was killed by the fascists. And he was a powerful writer, popular writer, and people just loved him. And that love for Lorca was multiplied several times after he was killed, because he was a fighter also on the side of the, on the whatever, the democratic side or anti-fascist side, So he became an icon. Now we judge Lorca because he sacrificed himself, or we judge Lorca on the basis of what he wrote. So we judge Lorca on the basis of on both the criteria, on the basis that he sacrificed himself. But when we come to evaluating his literature, even though psychologically we cannot separate, our respect for him will be multiplied several times because he became a martyr. But should we not have objective standard criteria of evaluating even his literature? Should we become blind to the quality of his literature just because he was our hero? So whatever our heroes will write will become great literature, and whatever everybody else will write will not be great literature. Are we going to come to that criteria? I always boil down to these blunt questions, because these blunt questions are the best way to pose questions. Of course, nobody does exactly in this blunt way. So nobody loves Lorca just because he was our hero. People love Lorca because he wrote beautiful poetry, he wrote beautiful plays. They were already popular when he was alive. So we know we evaluate him on both the criteria, but we should be conscious of the fact that even in the case of our hero, his literature has to be evaluated on the literary basis. Just his being our hero is not enough of a criteria to judge his literature. Take two other writers. Neruda. Let us take Neruda. Neruda, was close to Allende. Allende was killed on 11th of September 1973. The other 9/11, that was forgotten. He was killed. He was the elected president, and he was killed by the coup, by the Americans and by Pinochet together. And Neruda was not there in the palace. Neruda was very close to Allende, and he had been a minister also in his government, and he had been not minister, maybe ambassador to many countries, I forget, but he had been an official of Allende's government. He was not in the palace, so he was not killed in the bombing of the palace. But suppose he had been there and killed in the bombing of the palace and became a martyr that way, whatever he wrote, that writing, evaluation of that writing will change if he was sacrificed that way. Probably he was sacrificed. That Neruda, probably he was killed. He died, he was suffering from cancer. He came back from hospital 11th of September. The coup happened, and on 23rd or 25th of September he died, and there is a suspicion that most likely he was injected by his doctor by some poison. So maybe he was killed. But nobody knew whether he was killed or not. And the Neruda poetry does not require, the beauty of Neruda poetry does not require his being martyred. Our evaluation of Neruda will go up if he was killed, and it would have gone up further, gone up more if he had been killed in the bombing of the palace where Allende was killed. But if I were to compare Neruda and Brecht, who died of heart attack, nobody killed him. So, and if I have a position that in some ways, when it comes to plays, I like Brecht more, when it comes to poetry, I like Neruda more, but should this factor that Neruda was killed and Brecht was not killed, should this become a criteria of my evaluating, their plays versus their poetry? That's the question I'm asking. That is the question I'm asking. So we have to become careful about literature. This simplistic position we take, whether it is Dalit literature, whether it is feminist literature, or whether it is proletarian literature, whatever we call it, Marxist literature or literature of the working class, we call it, we cannot justify it only on extra literary factors, on extra literary criteria. So we will have to have literary criteria, and that literary criteria cannot be only instrumentalist. What literature does it help revolution, and so on? If it also helps revolution directly, If that writer is also active in revolutionary movement, so far so good, it is better. We like that even more. But we cannot say that that is the only criteria. So you see, among the leftists, the debate that takes place, I don't know what happens in Telugu or in Kannada, but in Hindi, I know most of the leftists argue about proving that how much of a 24-carat leftist you are. So even when you are evaluating literature, you are actually evaluating that person, that writer, that whether he is an authentic writer or not. And then there are very crude things like, ridiculing everybody else and proving yourself as the greatest revolutionary. And since you are a greatest revolutionary, you are also the greatest revolutionary writer, and you know best about literature and what is good literature and what is best literature. All this caricature is going on among the leftist Hindi writers all the time. How do we raise this question? Because our own community, our own leftist writers have become sectarians in this way, have become broad extra literary criteria to judge literature. It is good to evaluate individuals as courageous revolutionaries, but it is not enough for courageous revolutionaries to become good writers. So what are the criteria to become good writers? Good writers are those who create good literature. And what is good literature? That, along with helping the revolutionary movement, also creates cultured human beings, also delves deeper into the vertical dimension, also sheds new light on the human condition. What is the meaning of being human? What is the meaning of being a human individual? That also, our literature doesn't have the job only of becoming the songs of the revolutionary on the front line. That also it should do. I am not negating that. That also it should do. But it should shed light on the meaning of being human. It should shed light on the philosophy of being human. It should shed light on the depths of my soul. So literature, even the leftist literature, must descend into the depths of the human soul, so to speak. We don't believe in souls. But the language is, language was created thousands of years ago, and gods and souls are there in the language. What can we do? That is why I call vertical dimension, but I wasn't sure that whether you got it or not, so I am using that religious language soul. Our literature, our revolutionary literature also descends, climbs down the stairs of the well of our being. Get into the depths of our being. That also the job of the leftist literature. So I will stop there, and I don't know whether you were prepared for an hour and a half or not, but I had to conclude my part there. So I thought that I will say all that I have to say in the first round, so that we then have a full-scale discussion that can go on for next several meetings. I promise you that I will not torture you with 1 hour or 1.5 hour presentation in the future, but then you have to promise me that you can run the meeting through discussion or your presentation for 2 hours, whatever time we decide. Thank you.